Hey adventurers, I was requested to do this video and so I am going to do it. This is a fantasy genre breakdown, so basically I'm just going to go through not all of them because there's so many, but I'm going to go through and give a little bit of description on various different subgenres of fantasy. So to start out, YA fantasy and adult fantasy. So YA fantasy are stories that are specifically written with a younger audience in mind. Young YA stands for young adult, so this would be basically the 12 to 18 range, or 12 to 20 even. This is more of a publishing classification than a true genre. Some examples of YA fantasy would be Harry Potter and the Kane Chronicles. For adult fantasy, these are stories that are specifically written with an adult audience in mind. Again, it's very much of a publication classification rather than a true genre. Some examples of this are Mistborn is technically a adult fantasy, although it's also been marketed as a young adult fantasy. The Dark Tower by Stephen King and A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. So the three main kind of like these big umbrella subgenres are high/epic fantasy, low fantasy, and then portal fantasy. So high and epic fantasy, some people say they're different things. They're pretty much the same thing from everything that I have read and can see. They are set in their own unique world that they have created, that the author has created for this story to take place in. If I were to give a difference between high fantasy and epic fantasy, I'd say that high fantasy is anything set in its own world, and epic fantasy is specifically a book or series that is utterly huge in scale. This can be a large number of books, or it can be just the obvious amount of world building that has gone into the world and the various details of everything that have happened. Some examples of high/epic fantasy are The Lord of the Rings, which of course I've got to include, and then the Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive is going to be a 10-book series, so therefore it constitutes it as that epic fantasy. It's also it's also set on its own world, which means that it's a high fantasy. So it doesn't matter really. Those two titles are both basically the same genre. Low fantasy. Low fantasy is fantasy that is set on Earth and usually hidden from the general populace by some magic of some sort. For example, Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a magical world that the Muggles can't see. Well, they can see it, they just don't understand what it is, and they brush it off as not being magic. There's also some magical things in place to keep them from learning about the magical world. Another example that I have for this is A Monster Calls. This is fantasy because it has fantastical creatures in it, but it's different. It is set on Earth. I believe it's set in London. I may be wrong about that though. But it's set on Earth. The magical element, the fantasy elements, are the monsters that Connor sees. So yes, it is low fantasy, but it's still fantasy. Portal fantasy is a fantasy where you are somehow transported from Earth to another realm that is more magical and is very much a fantasy world. So you leave Earth to go to a high fantasy, except that it's not, because Earth still exists. So it's kind of a mixture between low fantasy and high fantasy. Some examples of portal fantasy are The Chronicles of Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, and The Wizard of Oz, even. So now I'm going to get into some more definite subgenres of fantasy. Christian fantasy. This is fantasy that is heavily based off of and oftentimes has strong allegorical or biblical themes. Again, some examples of this are The Chronicles of Narnia, The Weaver Trilogy by Lindsay Franklin, and Time Quartet by Madeleine L'Engle. This is kind of basically Christian fantasy isn't so much a genre again, or a subgenre again, as it is just the things that are incorporated into it are very much based out of the Bible and Christian culture, I guess. Urban/contemporary/modern fantasy. This is fantasy that takes place in the modern time period. From what I saw and found, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, and modern fantasy. They're kind of terms used interchangeably. Although there are times, or not times, there's some people that call modern fantasy as fantasy that was written recently, basically. I don't know what recently is, maybe the past 10 to 20 years, because I think many people would call Harry Potter modern fantasy, and that was written over 20 years ago now. Some examples of this are Dresden Files, although I believe this is also a high fantasy that has only recently I don't know, I haven't read Dresden Files, but Dresden Files, Percy Jackson and the Olympians is a modern fantasy. It fits into many other genres as well. Science fantasy. So science fantasy is fantasy that is very much fantasy, but is also blended with some science fiction elements, so spaceships, that type of stuff. Technology and magic are both very common, and often you will have this thing where the magic can be explained through science, at which point I'm not sure how it's still magic, but it is. Some examples of this are Mistborn Era 2, Dune, and probably the most well-known example of this is actually Star Wars. Normally I wouldn't use movies for examples in this book video, but because it's such a perfect example, I've got to. Grimdark fantasy. So grimdark fantasy is usually high fantasy, although I'm sure there's grimdark fantasy that is not high fantasy. It's set in a gritty, dark world, focusing on mostly morally gray characters who are out to better themselves and don't care about much else. There's not a lot of hope in these stories, and it's definitely more based around the themes of just like these people are horrible, everybody's horrible, than it is an aesthetic, and I'll explain why in just a second. So some examples of grimdark fantasy would be A Song of Ice and Fire. As far as I know, I haven't read that series either. The First Law by Joe Abercrombie, and then the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks, I believe. So dark fantasy is different than grimdark fantasy. Dark fantasy is a fantasy stories that have gloomy, frightening, or ominous tone, often incorporating monsters like vampires or werewolves. Though the world is dark and scary, there is still hope. So that's really what distinguishes grimdark from dark fantasy, is dark fantasy still has that aspect of hope. Dark fantasy is more of an aesthetic than it is about the themes, whereas, like I said, grimdark is more about the themes than it is the aesthetic. Some examples of dark fantasy are Coraline by Neil Gaiman, The Dark Tower by Stephen King, and then The Sandman, which I believe is also by Neil Gaiman. Dystopian fantasy. So dystopian fantasy is a dystopian world with elements of fantasy in it rather than just straight science fiction. I actually had a very hard time finding examples of this, and then once I found them, I found a ton of them. I don't know that all of these are true dystopian fantasies. All the examples that I found were true dystopian fantasies because I haven't read most of them. But some examples that I came up with were The Giver Quartet, which I have read, and I know, yes, that's very much dystopian fantasy rather than dystopian sci-fi. So The Giver Quartet, Mortal Engines, which I haven't read, and I'm pretty sure that the movie is quite a bit different than the books, so going off the books here. And then The Lorax, which I would absolutely classify The Lorax as dystopian fantasy. Because this is a fantasy genre breakdown, I'm not including other dystopians like the Divergent series or the Hunger Games series, because those ones, from what I understand, I haven't read Divergent, but I know for a fact that Hunger Games is definitely all science. Everything can be explained by science. So now these last set of fantasy subgenres that I'm going to be talking about are really just like one defining feature, and the book fits into that category. So quest fantasy. These are stories where a character or a group of characters goes on a quest in a fantasy world. The quest isn't always even the entire story. So some examples of this are The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and I decided to go with this because it's not a book that I've seen talked about nearly enough, and that is Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. I read this book and I loved it, and it has some quest fantasy elements in it, so it fits into this category. Coming of age fantasy. A story about a person growing up and becoming something more than they were when the story began, set in a fantasy world. Examples are the Kingkiller Chronicles, The Wheel of Time, and pretty much every fantasy story ever written. So the thing about subgenres is most of the time, any single book can fit into a ton of different subgenres. They're not really defined by one specific subgenre. Historical fantasy. Stories set in a specific historical period with elements of fantasy, such as magic or fantastic beasts. lots of times the Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Egyptian mythology or Norse mythology, all these stories are oftentimes what would be considered historical fantasy. They are set in a very specific historical time period or are based around historic events, but they also have incorporate these fantasy elements. So some examples of this are the Iliad. That's I believe, Greek mythology story, and it absolutely fits into this historical fantasy setting because the events did happen. The Battle of Troy happened. There's things that actually happened. There's just these other parts that are brought in. Another example would be City of Brass, which I haven't read and I didn't write down the author, so I don't remember who that's by. Anthropomorphic Fantasy. This is fantasy where animals take on human characteristics. The animals are either the main characters or they exist. So technically Narnia is also considered an anthropomorphic fantasy. But the examples that I came up with are Guardians of Ga'Hoole, which is a series about owls and wolves to some extent, but mostly owls. And these owls take on human characteristics. They can talk, they have a whole society, they have wars, they have everything. It's very interesting. I actually really love this series, and I don't think it's talked about nearly enough. The other example that I chose is Redwall. Redwall is very much the same thing. All the different animals can talk, they all have their personalities, their societies, their human characteristics that, while it is fantasy, it's also about the animals rather than humans. So yeah, that's an anthropomorphic fantasy. A dragon fantasy. This is stories where dragons have a large role. Like, this is the type of subgenres that people get into, is they'll just be like dragon fantasy or quest fantasy. You know, it's just, if they have this specific element in them, then they fit into this subgenre. So some examples of dragon fantasy are How to Train a Dragon and The Inheritance Cycle. I mean, there's hundreds of them. The Hobbit fits into that because there's a dragon with an important role. You know, there's so many stories that fit into this subgenre because this subgenre is so specific and yet so broad. Fable/fairy tale fantasy. These are stories that have a heavy use of motifs or plots from folklore. Lots of retellings fall into this genre. So that would be like Beauty and the Beast. These stories, most of the Brothers Grimm are these fairy tale fantasy. The examples that I came up with are Midsummer's Night Dream by William Shakespeare and The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Basically the play that everybody knows as The Nutcracker, that's based off of a book that is considered fairy tale fantasy or fable fantasy. Supernatural fantasy. This was a subgenre that I actually had a difficult-ish time finding a good definition of because it seems like nobody agrees on what this is. But it seems to me like supernatural fantasy is basically a story set on Earth where the humans don't have magical abilities, but there are other supernatural monsters and creatures like ghosts or demons that do exist and that interact with the world. Sometimes the humans can access magic too. Like, this is kind of just anything that is supernatural fits into the supernatural fantasy for the most part. There's also paranormal fiction, which is kind of, it's a mess. Subgenres are a mess. Some examples of this that I came up with were Frankenstein and Twilight. Superhero fantasy. This is stories about superheroes. Very rarely are these straight sci-fi. Most of the time they have aspects of fantasy in them too. Fail State by John Oddie that Kate read and loved is an example of this. Marvel Comics and DC Comics and Dark Horse Comics and pretty much any comics that are written about superheroes fall into this superhero fantasy. And then Arthurian Fantasy. These are stories about King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, or at least based on that story somehow. The examples I came up with for this are The Once and Future King, which is probably the most well-known Arthurian fantasy tale. Another one that I came up with, and I just realized that it might not actually be fantasy, is Black Horses for the King, which is a story about the horses that King Arthur rode, but it's written more about the believed historical character that Arthur was based off of. This one may just be considered historical fiction, which is again another subgenre but not fantasy, or it may be historical fantasy. So again, you're seeing all these different crossovers between subgenres. No book fits into only one subgenre. You know, who knows how many they fit into? They fit into a lot. So that is just a small taste of the hundreds and hundreds of subgenres that are available. I mean, you could pretty much pick any object, or yeah, pretty much pick anything and make a subgenre, a fantasy subgenre out of it. So, you know, you could have bear fantasy, or light fantasy, or electrical, you know, like it doesn't matter, you can pull from anything and it can become a subgenre. I don't know if this is useful to anybody. There's a ton of other people who have done videos like this that are way better and way more extensive than this one. This was requested of me to do, and so I did it. But if you want a better, more in-depth kind of fantasy subgenre breakdown, I would recommend the video that Daniel Green did on his channel. I don't know how long ago now, but I will have that linked in the description down below if you want to watch that one. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any more videos that you want Kate or I to do, or both of us to do, let us know in the comments down below. Also, let us know what you think of this whole subgenre topic, because it's seems kind of unnecessary in some ways, and at the same time I can see exactly how it's useful and why it's useful. That's mostly for marketing. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like the video if you did enjoy it, and comment down below, and subscribe to us if you haven't already. We will see you guys next time. Stay warm.